All right, so let's get into chapter 3, session 3, Let's Talk. So obviously this chapter is about communication. So as we said before, we're really about halfway here. So we want to make sure that we don't have any hesitations about this couple being called together, and that we're happy to see them continue to progress in the premarital, as are they. But again, it's a good time to check in with their overseer or their pastor, whoever's going to be marrying them, if that's not you, and make sure you give an update on progression. Not all the details, but an update is good. So obviously we had sought permission from them to be able to do that, and hopefully they've granted that permission. So let them know how you're feeling about how they're doing. Give them some maybe progression reports and let them know how you feel about them as a couple. That will encourage them. Make sure that you do not spend an extraordinary amount of time on things that they disagree on. Make sure you also spend some time on things that they agree on, because that will affirm them. As well, as you open up this chapter, we have a kind of some percentages here about communication. This is something that a really well-known author, Norm Wright, talks about. He says that 7% of conversation is actually content or communication, 38% is attitude or tone of voice, and 55% is body language. So let me give you an example of that. We can say, let's say we're both coming home from work, and our spouse maybe precedes us. Let's say it's our wife, and she's in the kitchen thinking about the return of her husband, and she's thinking about how much she missed him. He walks in the door, and she says, "I love you, I missed you today," and she begins moving towards him with her arms out. So the content is there, the attitude and tone of voice is good, and she's moving towards him. That's good body language. And he simply says, yeah, I love you too, and says, "Where's the mail?" and moves right beyond her arms. So obviously the content was there. He said, "I love you too," but that's not what she heard. She didn't hear that message. She probably heard something like, "Oh, he must be still upset from this morning," or "He had a really hard day today, and he doesn't want to talk about it. He just doesn't want me. He wants the mail." So we're staying in tune with the content of the message, with the attitude or tone of voice, and with the body language. So be aware of that, and don't overlook that as you sit with this couple and help them in their sharing together and in their openness. So every couple has conflict. Every couple. And it's good for you to share that you do as well. It's not whether or not we have conflict, it's whether we can resolve that conflict. Unfortunately, a lot of families don't teach their children how to resolve conflict. They just let them have a conflict. Or maybe they didn't see an example of parents resolving conflict. They just knew that their dad left the house and he stormed out, or the mom became silent, or they went to bed angry. Silence is not going to help. I remember the story of a husband and wife who decided to give each other the silent treatment. And so obviously neither one wants to be the first one to talk. And so the husband had to get up really early for a flight the next morning, and he wrote out a note to his wife, who was preceding him in getting up, and said, "Wake me up at 5 a.m. Excuse me. So he wrote this note. He didn't want to verbalize to her, "Wake me up at 5 a.m. And he wrote the note, and he put it on the table for her to see. She got up, saw the note, wrote her own note, and took it into the bedroom and laid it beside him, and it said, "It's 5 o'clock, get up." So neither one of them were willing to give in. Neither one of them were willing to speak. It's a humorous story, but it makes the point. So page 45 is just simply what we call a Likert scale. Likert scale meaning always, usually, sometimes, rarely, never. But it looks at a lot of different topics. It goes through 1 through 20. So we're hitting on listening, we're hitting on understanding, we're hitting on appreciation, we're hitting on interest and ideas and thoughts. Are we open to those, from hearing from one another? We're also looking at personality traits, like one likes facts and information, the other one likes more feeling and emotional communication, and they're able to express that. What about their hobbies? What about do they respond in a thoughtful, non-judgmental way, or do they feel judged? Are they feeling judged in their communication? So they're able to mark this with an X, always, usually, sometimes, rarely, or never, and then able to look at one another's responses. Page 46, cover communication guidelines. This is an excellent exercise with a lot of different scriptures. To be a ready listener, do not answer until the other person is finished. That's right out of the book of Proverbs, James 1. Be slow to speak, think first. Don't be hasty in your words, etc. There's 14 different ways of communication here, straight out of the Bible. Number 14, do not gossip. And there's scriptures after each one. And then we have some guidelines for them to look at, some communication ideas for them to look at. There's two ways to communicate something. You can say you don't really care, or you can say I really need you right now. You can say, well, what do you have to complain about today? Or you can say it sounds like you had a difficult day. Is there any way that I can help you? I remember our children at the meal table saying, well, that wasn't a very good meal. There's something very negative about the food. So we instituted something in our family where the kids had to thank their mother or whoever cooked the meal, their father or their grandparent, whoever cooked the meal, they had to thank them for the meal at the end of the meal, and then they had to take their plate into the kitchen. So when they had to thank their parent for the meal, it was pretty hard to complain about it throughout the meal. So how we communicate, there's just two different ways of communicating here, and they're asked to respond to those different ways. We enjoy that exercise a lot, and I think the couples enjoy doing it because they see the reflection of both. There's one negative way to say it, and there's also a very positive way to say things. So let's go, there's some scriptures here on how to become an effective communicator on page 48 and 49. Let's go to page 50 and have we discussed there, again, those are a huge number of things, 25 areas to look at, areas if they've discussed it, if they need to discuss it, and that's a real help for them to look at those areas and discover whether they need to discuss these things or we've discussed them. So, and some things can be a bit challenging for them to look at, but it's also for the counselor, for yourselves, to be able to make sure that we do discuss these things if they haven't. And then we look at page 50 and 51, what do we do when we disagree? You need to be really, really familiar with this because this is really about conflict resolution. It is talking about how do we resolve the conflicts in our life? How does pride get in there into our conflicts? How do we represent Christ in this relationship? How do we walk in humility? Something that we discovered for ourselves, and it talks about it in this writing here on page 50 and 51, is that two individuals came into the wedding, but one individual left. That means Steve and Mary showed up as individual singles. We were under the authority of our families or our parents and others, but when we got married, when we said I do, Steve became Mary and Mary became Steve. There's something about oneness in the scripture that's so very important, and we talk about that in this section. And then, of course, moving on, page 52, we continue to cover that area and then go into scenario communication. Scenario communication is really established throughout the book where they have a scenario and then they have to respond to it. Now, these are scenarios that they don't think that they're going to have, but they get to read them. And for example, it has been over a week since the clothes were washed. You are out of socks. We had a young girl write, so wash some socks in the sink or whatever you need to do to have clean socks. Sometimes men don't know how a sock goes from being dirty to being clean and in their drawer. But as Mary said earlier, some are waiting longer to marry, and so they are doing their own wash. So just different scenarios, and then we go into fair fighting or fighting fair on page 53. The process of working through a disagreement. We want you to take them through this. We actually ask if there's an area of disagreement in your life, an area of disagreement that's been in their life. It's good to take them through this process. But listen, word of warning is don't get back into your argument as you go through this. So what are the steps? Well, there's 7 steps there. The first thing you need to identify in a conflict is you both need to understand what you're each saying. And then you need to set aside time. Sometimes we get into the heat of the moment and we really don't have time to finish this, but we need to set aside time. We need to find what we agree on. Mary and I had lots of financial disagreements, but we then had to talk about, well, what is it that we agree on in finances? Stay on the subject at hand, appreciate what each other has to say, identify what the needs are out of the request. Sometimes we have a disagreement, and it's not because someone wants something bad. Maybe both of us want something good, but we're disagreeing on what that is or how that's going to be. So identify what needs are we trying to have met with that disagreement. Explore the options and move towards a solution. Unfortunately, we get into a lot of disagreements and we don't move towards a solution. We just stay in the disagreement. And sometimes we just analogy that I use sometimes, if you remember the old Western, they had a 6-shooter. And that 6 was called a 6-shooter because it had 6 bullets in it and went around in the magazine. And once they were done firing 6 bullets, they were done. But if you remember, on their holster or on their belt, they had some more bullets. Sometimes I call that running, you're out of all your bullets out through your 6-shooter. And then you load it up for some more information or some more facts that you can fight about. Or maybe you sense that you're losing and now you're arguing about the vacuum cleaner, which isn't even part of this conflict. What we don't do often is move towards what is the solution for this disagreement? What are we going to do about it? And hopefully this process can help take that couple towards the solution. And then on page 55, we start with something that we think is one of the most important things a couple can do, and that's pray together. Why is prayer so intimate? Why is it so important? Why should it be so valuable in this couple's lives? I don't know you very well, but if I would take one of you aside and I would begin to pray with you for 30 minutes each week, say every Monday morning, we met from 6 a.m. to 6:30, and we just prayed. We didn't talk about the game on Sunday. We didn't talk about the weather. We didn't talk about anything. We just met at 6 a.m. and we started praying, and we finished at 6:30. We concluded praying, and we would come back together again the next week. I would guarantee you that in just a short time, maybe a month, maybe a couple of months, I would probably know more about you than most people know, because in prayer, we divulge our heart and we open up to one another. And unfortunately, so many couples have diverted to a same-sex friend that they pray with, just another prayer partner, because they're not praying in their own marriage. Now, one of the things that we caution about praying together with this couple, of course, we encourage it and we want them to learn prayer now, but we also talk in this exercise, are there places that they shouldn't pray together? Like a dark car or like a bedroom. And here's the reason. The enemy wants to take something called prayer, something very spiritual, and he wants to make it sensual. Because when we get into the spirit in that way in praying, it's very easy to slide over into the sensual. So we want to be very, very careful about that. How often are we praying and where are we praying? And obviously we're going to take this into postmarital and we want to take it into their marriages. So praying together. Premarital counseling couples that are not praying together, they're missing out on something very, very intimate. And they're missing out on something that I think that God wants to take them up on. So they need to start small. Maybe it's just a couple of minutes at the end of a date, it's at the end of a meeting, whatever it is. But we want to encourage them to start praying. And maybe you can encourage them to do it right there in front of you. They can take each other's hand and they can just pray for one another. Speaking of intimacy, there is a premarital caveat, prayer, the spiritual, leading to the sensual. We're also checking with them on their boundaries. Each time we get together, we want to make sure that they're maintaining their sexual boundaries and that they had to use their phrase. In the next video, we want to cover chapters 4 through 6. Thanks so much for joining us. Meanwhile, here's a question for you to think about. How can we, as counseling couples, grow in our prayer intimacy together? So, premarital counseling couples that are not praying together, it's so good to encourage them to start somewhere, and maybe they can start right there in front of you and pray for one another, pray for you. Obviously, you're modeling this whole aspect of praying together, but start small, have it become a habit so that they can carry it into their actual marriage. Praying is intimacy. And speaking of intimacy, we're once again checking on their sexual boundaries. We're finding out that they're staying within those boundaries, and we're also asking them, have they had to use their phrase? So we would like to close this communication chapter with asking you a question. and asking you to think about this question. How can we grow as premarital counselors? How can we grow our prayer intimacy lives together ourselves? So I want to leave you with that question. Then also, as you think about that, I want to look at moving on ahead in the book and going to the next chapter, session 4, which is finances. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is a really, really important chapter to me because finances, we're told, is the number one reason for marriages splitting up or divorcing. It is the number one reason that couples struggle because they have different financial values. So we're going to really spend some time here with a couple looking at finances, looking at their individuals' incomes, of course, their outgoing, their debt. What do they bring into the marriage? I can remember sitting with a couple that his value was to be debt-free. His car was old and it was beat up, but he was debt-free. His college, he was taking his college as he had the money to pay for his college, so he was debt-free. He was working several jobs, but he was marrying someone who had a brand new car with a brand new car payment and someone who also had accrued quite a bit of college debt. So you could already see the differing values between the two of them that they were going to have to work out. But we asked them a really, really important question, and that was this. We asked the guy if he was willing to assume the debt that they would be carrying because her debt would become our debt. And he was, and he said that they had already talked about it, and he said that that was something that they were going to work on together. Amos 3:3 says, "How can two walk together unless they've agreed to do so?" Mary and I learned early on concerning finances, which it seemed to be that we had our most disagreements in that area, but we learned early on that we could fight and argue or we could pray and agree. And we learned that because we spent 8 years in mission work where we had no income. We just had to pray and agree for our income. I mean, we can fight and argue about the last person who spent $1 for a soda and a candy bar, or we could pray and agree. And so we found that prayer and agreement, well, arguing is very powerful. We found out that prayer and agreement is even more powerful. So I'm really big on this whole financial thing and working out the biblical financial values and sharing the scriptures with them. And so we look at on page 57 their personal financial views. Again, remember, you're looking at the instructions on the assignment to see are they filling it out individually, are they filling it out together. So who will do the bookkeeping in this relationship? How often will you go out to eat? How will you use credit cards? I know that a credit card is used a lot today. I know that very much in this culture we're not using cash. But we also are told that when we use credit cards, we can actually spend more money. So the use of credit cards, the value of credit cards, what percentage of our checks should be saved? Number 11, what percentage of your income should be tithed? Just kind of throwing the thought out there of, are we going to give out of our resource? How much freedom do you want to give each other to spend money? Do you have a limit on that? I mean, can you spend $100 and not be questioned by your spouse, or can you spend $25? So then we look at views on debt. We brought this into the book. It wasn't in there originally because we discovered that a lot of young people were coming into marriage with huge college debt. I think right now the average debt for a student coming out of college is somewhere around $30,000, $33,000. That's going to be like a mortgage payment or a rent payment in the very beginning of their marriage. That's pretty big. And so they need to understand that debt that they're carrying and how it becomes ours. So what is their financial view? How are they viewing debt? How do we view debt, and are we carrying debt into our marriage? Also, financial background. Did our parents maintain a budget? If they didn't maintain a budget, maybe we don't. Who was in charge of the finances with our parents? Were the bills paid on time? Sometimes we have reactions to the fact that when the bills came due, we had to move. And of course, we're looking for someone with a solid income, someone that doesn't have that value, someone that's willing to pay their bills on time, because that means security to us. I discovered early on that when my wife had a sufficient grocery budget, she felt to go to the grocery store and purchase groceries. and bring her groceries home and stock her shelves, it represented security to her. It represented that she was able to feed her family. I didn't know that grocery allowance or bringing groceries from the grocery store represented security to her until we walked through and worked through that, because we had some differences in what the grocery bill should be. Did our parents tithe? Did our parents support missions? Did we go on vacations? You know, we get into some families that just never prioritize vacations. And so the young people that come into marriage may not necessarily prioritize putting funds towards vacations. And we look at scriptural truths about finances, page 60. There's quite a number of scriptures here that talk about some very, very clear scriptural truths. And then page 61, we start with a personal financial budget. Page 61 to 64 are looking at a personal financial budget. I love this section because most times couples don't come into this relationship with a budget, or maybe they're doing something, they're writing some things down on a piece of paper. I don't know. Maybe when they're done with their paycheck, they're done spending money, and that's their budget. But listen, a budget is a picture. A budget will never stop you from spending money. It's just a picture. It shows the income, it shows the outgoing, and it shows what's left. Obviously, the idea is that we have income, we pay our bills, and we have money left over. But unfortunately, so many people don't understand that aspect of budgeting and don't have money left over. So why do we look at a whole year of budgeting rather than just a month? Because 1 month is not going to give us a clear picture of budgeting. We need to look at the whole year, because sometimes we have bills that come due every quarter, every semi-annually, and sometimes annually. So it's very important to get the whole picture of what our budget is. Oftentimes couples need help. We obviously have a sample here, and then we go into a blank page for them to fill out. But sometimes they need help on that budget, and that's okay. You can help them. Sometimes they don't have a clue about budgeting. Sometimes because they've come into debt because they don't know that you're to budget your finances. So sometimes we do actually recommend the Dave Ramsey course or the Compass course, something that will help them beyond what that you can give them. Make sure you're aware of that, and make sure you're aware of those courses so that you're able to recommend them. I know that we sent a couple. We found the Dave Ramsey course locally, and we said to them, if you don't have the finance, we'll pay for the course, but we want to send you to this because you both need a lot of help in the financial realm. They went to it, they submitted to it, and they learned a whole lot about finances, something that just did not come from their parents, and something that we just didn't necessarily have time to teach them. So on the side of their premarital, they were able to go and get that help. So this is a really important area, and obviously we need you to be familiar with this budget. Maybe you don't use it, and that's okay, but you need to be familiar with it so you know how to work it. There's a cumulative savings on the bottom, and we know that we need to do that because we have bills that are due at different times of the year. So please be familiar with it, and please give this section the best that you can possibly give them.
The next section is on sexual relations, and I want to share a story. We got a call from a father that we knew in our area, and he let us know that his daughter was pregnant and not married, and asked would we consider doing the premarital counseling for his daughter and her boyfriend. And we said, well, we'll have to meet with them first, and then we'll pray about it. And so we got the couple with us and heard their story, and had prayed about it before they came to see us, and told them that we would have faith to do their premarital counseling if they would be willing to be abstinent from that point on till they got married. And they immediately said they would not. There was no way that they were not going to stop being sexual. And so we said, then we are not in faith to do your premarital counseling. And that was how the session ended. So you need to be in faith to counsel people. You need to be in faith with the situations that you're going to incur. And pregnancy is not a reason to get married. Maybe something to consider for marriage, but it is not the reason to get married. And there was a whole lot else that this couple needed to deal with. So we politely refused and did not do their premarital counseling.
Okay, so don't do this chapter unless you're able to talk about sexual things without getting embarrassed, and you're able to use correct anatomy. So I can remember one time that we used correct anatomy on body parts with our children, and my family did not. So one weekend, my parents were visiting, and my daughter was quite young, and she discovered that her brothers had some anatomy that she didn't have. And so at supper, she decided to announce that her brothers had a penis. I don't exactly remember how old she was, but immediately my mother said, "What did she say?" And I looked at my daughter and I said, "No, we're not having peanuts for supper." And I said, "Peanuts, Mom." So she goes, "Oh, I thought she said something else." So obviously that would have been embarrassing for my mother and my family, but it wasn't to us. We taught our children the proper anatomy, and those are the terms that we're going to need to use as pre- and postmarital counselors. So God made our bodies. He's not ashamed of them, and our body parts, and we have correct terminology for them. So let's use that. God created sex for our enjoyment, not just for procreation. We talk about that in this chapter. And so that's something that we talk about as well. Now, some couples think that lust is over with once they get married. And we like to talk about that because it's really not. The definition of lust for us has become taking. And the definition of love is giving. So sexuality really is about giving. It's not about taking. In lust, it's all about taking. In pornography, it's all about taking. In our youth, in our immaturity, it's all about taking. But in marriage, it's all about giving. So we want to make sure that we share that principle with these couples that we're walking with. What if this couple has crossed the boundaries? What if they've gone beyond their boundaries? What if they've actually been sexual? Prior to this session or sometime in their lives, well, then we have a very serious discussion with them. We talk about that. We also talk about a verse in the Bible, Galatians 3:13. In that verse, it talks about Christ became a curse for us because cursed is the one who dies on the tree. And so Jesus took our curses for us on the cross. Jesus took our sexual shame. And so we talk about that and we pray about it. And we talk about maybe prior sexual experiences that might have been abusive. I can remember that we had a couple where the woman had been sexually molested by a farmhand when she was a child. These are things that happen. This is part of that Genesis 3 world that we live in. And so we talk about those things. We bring them up. And we want to make sure that they know that Jesus has an answer for these things and that the cross makes a difference. If the Center for Disease Control can say that whoever you had sex with, you're having sex with everyone that they had sex with. Now, if that's true physiologically, and we pass on disease in that way in the physical, isn't that also true in the spiritual? Isn't it also true that we need to break those spiritual ties or those connections that we've had with former relationships and walk this couple through that healing process as best you know how? Ask the Lord to bring His cross between them and that person that they might have been sexual with. Again, go to Galatians 3:13. That cross makes a difference. It breaks those connections, and just simply pray over that. Let them cry, let them do whatever they need to do, but let it come out so this couple is able to find freedom.
We counseled one couple who came into this session of sexual relations, and both of them were weeping. And so they told their story, and he was a virgin. He had saved himself for marriage sexually and had saved himself for this girl, and she had not. Her tears were tears of remorse and true sorrow, and his tears were feeling her pain and sorrow that she hadn't saved herself for him. So we walked through that, we talked about it, and did just what Steve had described prior. We broke soul connections, and we repented and apologized to one another, and then asked God to declare a new virginity over them and a fresh sexual relation for them when they entered their marriage bed. And so they left that session with a lot of peace and a lot of the past behind them, and it was a beautiful thing to witness. And they are happily married today, and that issue has not detracted from their marriage.
So sex is something we grow in, and we like to share that with the couples. It's something that takes time. Sex is not like any Hollywood movie they've ever seen, and it's just not that perfect. But it's just something that, as we get to know one another, it's something that we grow in, and for the couple who's not been sexual, there's a couple of things that we want to let them know. We want to let them know that the whole sexual experience can be painful. It can be a challenge. It can be a bit difficult starting out. We also share with this couple, maybe a doctor will tell them this, but I know it seems to be missing with most of the couples that we share with, is that they need to take with them, purchase KY jelly and take that with them. It's important for their honeymoon. We share with them why that's important. And we ask them if they've discussed with their doctor the whole aspect of being sexual for the first time. We ask them if they discussed their means or methods of birth control with one another and with their physician. Obviously, we don't want them to be embarrassed in any level of this communication, but we want to be thorough. We want to pray through this whole sexual section and their sexual lives. And we want to reinforce that sex is God's gift to them. Unfortunately, they've probably heard most of their life the word no connected to the word sex. And everything was about no. And so now they get into marriage and they're still hearing in their minds that word no. But in reality, God has always said yes, because it's His idea. It's something that He gives us in marriage. It's God's good idea. And so the enemy has obviously stolen that, created a counterfeit that says something like this: all the sex you want before marriage and no sex after marriage. And God says, obviously, no sex before marriage and all the sex you desire to enjoy after marriage. So this is a gift from God, and it's not something that we want the enemy to steal from us. There's a book that we appreciate. Obviously, in any book that you recommend, you can't recommend every word that they write. So there are things that you might not disagree with. But this book we found by the Penners, Clifford and Joyce Penner. It's called Getting Your Sex Life Off to a Great Start. And that means, it's a guide to the engaged couple and the newlywed couple specifically. So that's why we like this book, because it really is speaking to the newly married couple or the engaged couple. And we appreciate so much of what they say in that book. So that's a book that we would recommend for this section. Now, let's go to our book page. We have the opening to this chapter on page 65, then page 66. We talk about sex and marriage, and really the scripture talks about it. So we add the scriptures to this whole aspect of sex. It's obviously for procreation, but also God gave it to us for our enjoyment. So that's talked about in these scriptures. And then we look at questions for discussion. Do you feel that being a Christian will make any difference in your sexual relationship? What difference does that make? Will you be able to discuss with your spouse what you do not know about sexual relations? Is there anything that worries you or preoccupies you in your mind concerning sexual relations, being sexual with one another? After marriage, I love this question, number 4, page 67. After marriage, how do you expect to communicate your desire for sexual intercourse? We also have a question here. Let me try to find it. Is how often do you expect to engage in sexual relations once you're married? I love that question too, because I love to see how large the number can be. And obviously we come back to that in postmarital. So some really important questions here. Number 15, what about children? Have you discussed, the two of you, have you discussed your desires to have children? And if so, how soon, how many, how close in age, if the Lord would bless you with children. So some really very, very important questions here, and some questions that not meant to embarrass them in any way, but talking with them about this because so many people in their lives would not talk about it. Then we look at something called a creative plan. God's creative plan, because it's all His idea. And so that's what this goes through. Sexual pleasure is God's idea. There's some eight characteristics here of a creative lover. Again, be familiar with these pages so that you can walk them through it. Be attractive, be eager, be creative, be interested, be uninhibited. Obviously, we talk about hygiene in this section. Be involved in one another. and we just give some insights into how men are a little bit different than women. And we talk about sexual oneness and how that occurs. And we also have an important note here on page 71 under Roman numeral 5 or V. It says that pornography is false intimacy. It's fake, it's unrealistic, it's not real, and it's addictive. We give a lot of warning about pornography. There's no reason for pornography to be in our lives or to be in our marriages. It makes women very, very uncomfortable. But the truth is, so many people today are involved in pornography. So many on college campuses today are involved in pornography. Pornography is not something that will help you. I remember we had a couple that we took through this process, and they came to us, and he came and said that he had had an addiction to pornography, and he had tens of thousands of dollars in debt due to that addiction. So not only did he have a pornography addiction, but he brought debt into this new relationship from that addiction. So something very, very important to talk about there. And if there are issues in that area, obviously we want to take them through change, through repentance, through confession. And if there is addiction there are books, there are DVD series that they can walk through. There are groups today that meet in that area. Do not take that lightly. Now, I'm understanding today that something like 70% of people in America are viewing pornography. The statistics are very, very high. It starts at age 9 to 11. The reason that is because we have something called smartphones. And those phones give us the opportunity to have pornography-free access to it. So something to really key in on. God has a creative plan. We know that the enemy wants to steal that creative plan. Then we have some questions here in pages 72 to 74. There's matching questions. There's attitudes and belief about sex. A, agree. D, disagree. And then matching. And then also over on page 74, true or false. We actually have the answers to these exercises in the appendices, so make sure that you take them to the appendices, that they get the correct answers for these questions. Very, very important questions, matching questions, things on incest and impotence and HIV and different sexual terminology that they need to be familiar with. True and false questions, again, the answers are in the appendices that you can take them to. And then finally we cover page 75, marriage sex is better sex and why. Because single sex, meeting up at night and having a sexual encounter, that's very dangerous sex. It's also very fearful sex because we don't know if we're going to get caught or get found out. But the safest sex is obviously sex with your partner in marriage. But we also know that there's things that inhibit sexuality, so we talk about that. The things like overscheduling and depletion and lack of communication, not serving one another, lust, the lack of non-sexual touch, pornography, a whole list of things there. In the case of sexual abuse in their history, we give a little challenging paragraph here on page 76. Need to get some input into your life and some further counseling. So this is an area that's very, very important for the couples. It's an area that they're very anxious to go through. Some actually have anxiety about it. Again, it's an area where we need to use proper language. It's an area where we need to communicate thoroughly. And it's also an area where I think as premarital counselors, we can share that sex is not perfect, that you have to learn and grow in this area. You have to identify one another's needs and how to help meet those needs and serve one another, because sex is about love and love is about giving, while lust is about taking.